Civil Discussion on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Thursday, January 11th. Also a pleasure to be joined by my co-host here, Don Keelan. Don,
Andrew,
good to see
thank you
again.
for being here. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to everyone. Yes, indeed. It's been an interesting year already. It's been close to a month now since we've been here to talk civilly about one issue or another, and lots of stuff has come up since we were last around the table. And one of them, Don, is it's not a recently new issue at all by any means, but one that you wrote, I thought, a really interesting column was published in the local papers here about, well, the title is "Why Are So Few Homes Being Built?" And it describes a situation that occurred up in Westford, Vermont, a little bit north of here. I guess I just wondered, could you describe what was going on in Westford and what prompted you to write this piece?
Well, let me give a bit of background. Vermont has a very serious housing crisis. I think most people know about it. Matter of fact, I was sharing with Andrew this morning. The legislature and the governor's office and all three parties, the progressives, Republicans, excuse me, and Democrats, are working on trying to find a solution, whether it's providing more money, changing Act 250, creating more incentive in towns to create more housing. So I was looking at that, plus all the other things that we've done last year and the prior years to try to resolve the housing crisis, and we're really not getting at all to the solution. And what caught my attention was something that happened in Westford. Now, for our viewers, Westford is a small community, about 2,000 residents, and it's located just east of South Burlington, and just south of Essex, and very much in a way like Arlington, in a sense. It's been it's quite an old Vermont community. I think 1763 is when it was chartered by the king. But in any event, what happened in Westford was they had a vote this past fall, and the vote was to find out whether or not the community would approve a $400,000 bond to build a wastewater plant for the community. The community did not have a central wastewater system run by the municipality. The $400,000 would augment $4 million that the town already had, which I believe was unencumbered. It didn't have to borrow it. It was just given to them by what agency I'm not familiar with, but the $400,000 would have been a bond. The taxpayers would be obligated for it, but not the $4 million. So they only needed $400,000 more to get this sewer system going. And believe it or not, they turned it down. And many of the comments post-election or post-vote had to do with the fact that the town did not want change, and they didn't want this, and they did not want to turn Westford into Hoboken.
So how would an addition of a water treatment plant costing $400,000 change the town?
Because it was going to be the wastewater system was going to be in the central part of the town, serving something like 50 or 60 homes, several municipal buildings, the library, the town hall, and there could be more land available for growth if that could hook up to the plant. Obviously, it'd be limited, but there'd still be additional hookups now.
And as we all know, wastewater and municipal water and sewer, that infrastructure is absolutely critical to getting more housing built. I mean, every story I've ever done about housing always involves water treatment or water systems. It's a big part of it.
Absolutely, and in Arlington, there's a committee now working on developing a municipal wastewater system, which Arlington does not have at this moment. There's a small plant at the school that serves the high school, the elementary school, the library, and the daycare center, but that's about it. And there can be no further growth in the businesses that are there. Some of the businesses in the clinic are suffering now for the lack of wastewater. And from what I've gathered from talking to some of the old timers, they had an opportunity to do this back in the late 70s when there was a lot of federal aid available at that time. And they just didn't want it because they didn't want growth. They did not want to change the town. And this gets us to the issue, why I use Westford on the housing thing. They just do not want change. And they don't want something in their backyard. There's an acronym for it.
Not in my backyard.
Yeah,
NIMBY.
NIMBY. And the legislature, the governor's office, and all the other organizations can do all they want on housing by throwing a great deal of money at it, changing the environmental laws, changing the local zoning laws. But unless we address the issue of not in my backyard, you're not going to get any housing. Because now I put on my other hat, and that is of a real estate developer for over 40 years. We've experienced it not only here in Vermont, but in 7 other states. And you need to address it.
It's pretty universal. I mean, I just last week, I think, listening to a podcast about they're trying to develop housing in California, which really needs housing desperately, and same situation. It's just like people live in a town, it's a certain way. They've gotten used to it being a certain way, and they like it that way. And any kind of new project that might bring in 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 new housing units gets people nervous.
Well, what do you do about it?
So that's the question we want to try and tackle.
Okay. Well, first of all, before we get to what can you do about it, I think what we need to do is to identify it and have a discussion and find out what is it that is bothering people that they would not want this project, whether it's a wastewater plant, and you just had a recent issue, I believe, here in Manchester with a cell tower.
Yeah.
And it was quite had quite a bit of discussion. It was quite a big tower. I mean, 140 feet over, and I believe it was a Riley rink.
Right, over by, up by Hunter Park. There actually would have been the other side of those solar panels there as you go into the parking lot. But and then of course there was another panel, the cell tower discussion that would have been built more in the center of town. I'm not sure exactly where that stands, but same kind of arguments were advanced in both cases, where there's concerns about radiation, and there was concerns about it would be blocking someone's view or something like that, or it would be too visible in some way or another, and it would kind of interrupt the flow of the sight lines, I guess.
Well, we started out by saying housing, but it doesn't have to be housing.
No,
It's not restricted to housing. It's other projects. Over in the eastern part of the state, they were looking to build the state was looking to build a 6-unit center for children who needed to be housed
Right.
by the courts because we don't have a children's detention
That's
center.
the one in Newbury.
In Newbury, thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was reading about that last night, kind of in preparation for this. Yeah, it would replace the one that in Woodside that was closed like 3 or 4 years ago because there were some issues there, and the state doesn't have a facility for kids who need to be housed outside of a jail.
Yeah.
And this would be for 6 people.
Now and it was an old, not old, but a former bed and breakfast, I believe, and it seemed like it was fairly isolated up on the hill and all this other
300 acres of land around it.
Now, the town turned it down. The neighbors were really adamant about not having it, and I gather the Supreme Court made it overruled the town
Yeah.
and they're gonna have to develop it. Now, let's get back to
Right.
why,
We're going all over the place. Yeah.
and the why is, and here's where I have a bit of trouble. When you come into town and you're going to propose a project, and then you get people who really uh, um, internally do not want that project. They do not want it in their backyard, right? But they 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 throw up other reasons. Um, uh, there's too much traffic. There's going to be too much of a burden on the schools. There's going to be too much of a burden on the town services. All these other reasons are thrown at you, but the fact of the matter is they do not want the project, and that's, to me, it's a serious issue of intellectual dishonesty. Uh, but human nature being human nature, people will throw that up. Uh, I finally got someone up in. I interviewed folks up in Woodford in connection with the column, and this fellow came out and said to me flat out, he said, "We do not want to turn our small community into Hoboken, New Jersey." Well, that's really a far cry.
Hoboken, New Jersey isn't a bad place.
No, no,
I drove through there many times back in the good old days.
matter of fact, had you invested there 40 years ago, you'd be
You made a lot of money.
you wouldn't be here with me today.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's, to me, a very fascinating question, and it's a very important one because time doesn't stand still, right? I mean, things change all the time, and we either adapt with it and make the best out of it, or I think we put ourselves in a position where economic hardship is to follow. But one of the things I've often thought, asked myself, why is it that people seem to fear or not want projects like this? I was thinking about this, and a couple of things come to mind. One is, I know for a lot of people, their home is their biggest financial investment that they ever make, right? Um, that's where a lot of their wealth is essentially tied up. And I guess for many people, there's a perception that having the wrong kind of something across the street or in their backyard diminishes the value of the home. So if they get to a point where they want to sell it, instead of making, a profitable sum out of it, they're going to be forced to take something less than that, and maybe not be able to sell it as a result. And two, I think there's probably a legacy of big developments that were probably pushed through by the governments at the time. I'm thinking back to the first half of the 20th century, and having lived in New York for a while, thinking back to some of the housing developments that were built in New York, some of the highways that were built that divided communities, uh, some of the projects. I mean, I remember that term, the projects,
Yeah.
the housing projects. They were places where you probably didn't want to live if you had an alternative. I mean, they were just they had bad reputations of being places of crime and just the wrong kind of people being your neighbors, and you wanted to get out of there as quickly as you could. But I think there must be a historical legacy of these sorts of projects that were rammed through, and people just were expected to live with them, and they didn't always fit the neighborhood very well. And I think probably a lot of people, you know, rightly or wrongly, associate any kind of new thing with, oh my God, there goes the neighborhood.
Well, you're right, and it was called a good example. The highway that we went through was a Cross Bronx Expressway,
Right.
And the development of the projects, and some of them were absolutely horrible. They served a purpose at the time, maybe a very short period of time. A good example is the Pruitt-Igoe project in St. Louis. 7,000 homes were built, 7,000 apartments were built right after the rioting that took place after Dr. King was killed in 1968, only to be torn down 10 years later. 7,000 apartments in St. Louis. But in any event, what's happened, and I don't have the correct data here, but I would have to say that most folks in Vermont today, who are part of this program, the NIMBY program, are transplants from other places, whether it's New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, and what have you. And they've seen what growth can do. Now, it was necessary because they had a lot of people. I mean, they're, the Paramus, New Jersey, has major shopping that's nationally known. Why? Because Paramus is near a major population area. I mean, tens of millions of people. So obviously you're going to have shopping. They don't want that up here. They left that. And many folks came up here after 9/11. They came up here after the pandemic, and they any proposal for housing or shopping, or like a shopping center, triggers. I think, are we going to get another Paramus up here? It's kind of far out, but and so forth. But the thing is, it's that fear.
Yeah.
And they don't want it. Now, I'd like to see if we can move over to their side, and have an appreciation of what is it that really bothers them, and I think that what bothers them is, and they came up here, they thought it was rural. They had that beautiful house. There was a field across the street, and now that field is going to have a housing project of 50
or a
units.
solar farm or something. Yeah, well, I mean, and I think also there are a lot of folks who've lived here for generations who probably, grew up remembering Vermont a certain way when they were kids and thought that was great. And why do we want to do anything different now? Just sort of ignores the fact that time marches on and people need to make livings, and, work changes, and, we could go into a long conversation about, well, if you want to have stagnant economic development, you can watch your tax rates go skyrocketing because there's not going to be the economic infrastructure out there to generate wealth and generate money. But I think, what I find interesting about this is how would people talk, someone, let's say, who wants to develop a housing project or a solar field. I mean, I'm thinking of two recent examples from Manchester. There was that proposal to put up a housing project there on Depot Street behind the building where the town hall used to be. That got, voted down. So what is it? What would it take to have a conversation between someone who, whether it's a municipal government or a private sector developer, to say, hey, this 30 or 40 unit housing project here would help your community. You would give low cost housing to people that right now can't afford to live there, who work in town. So instead of them driving from Granville, New York, or farther north, 30 or 40 miles away, they could live right here and be part of your community and walk to work. Versus this fear of change, that they don't know what the change is going to be like, and it's going to diminish the value of their own home.
Interesting, you mentioned people could live in the community. This column I did on Westford, there were 34 or 36 letters to the editor about the column, and most of them were not in favor of changing. They supported the NIMBY concept. I couldn't believe it, but that's the way it was. And one of the folks writing a comment, a rebuttal to my column, said, she had to travel, or no, I'm sorry, her husband had to travel several hours when they commuted to New York City. So therefore, why can't Vermonters travel? Why do they need to live in the community in which they work? Right? So we have a bit of education to do here, because when we first came here, when I came here 40 years, 30, almost 40 years, 40 years now, uh, most of the people who worked in Manchester, who worked in Manchester, lived in Manchester. I know in Arlington that was the case. Most of the folks at Mac and then later on at Orvis worked there. That's not the case as of recent.
And that has a big impact on things like volunteer fire departments and rescue squads. I mean, it used to be, somebody who's a volunteer firefighter could put a sign on the door saying, "I'm back in 2 hours, I'm on a fire call." And, forget about that now.
That's when you go through all of the services, and then another one that's going to come hit us hard in this area over the next several years is the loss of primary care medical practices. We are really facing a major disaster in that area unless it can be fixed with bringing in a primary care doctor. And I don't know where they're going to set up shop, because a number of the practices have already closed and they're planning to close. And we're talking maybe putting on the market over 20,000 patients without a doctor.
And this in the state that's one of the oldest in the country.
Yeah, and I'm up there in age, like 84, and it's the first time in my life I don't have a doctor, a primary care doctor, right? And many others are in the same boat as I am, right? So there's a lot to the issue, but I think in trying to help the folks that have this NIMBYism issue, I think as a developer, I would ask, first get it on the table. What is it that's bothering you about this project? Right? And let's just use the example of housing. Okay, I'm going to propose 50 units across the street from you, multifamily. In other words, 1/1 or 1/2. And you see a lot of that going on now in South Burlington. That's the only way they can do it. That's affordable. So is it the 50 units that bother you? If we had 1 unit, would that be okay? Or is there somewhere between 1 and 50 that you'd be happy with?
Or is it
Would you be happy with
and less than 0?
Would you be happy with more screening of the project?
Yeah.
Would you be happy if we did more impact work, meaning provide more aid to the school, the fire department, or to the municipality? Right? The idea is to get folks to come out and say why are they really against it. I was looking at going back to the children's place in Newbury. The excuses had really nothing to do with the 6 kids. I mean, that were going to be there. I mean, the impact was so minimal. Right? There would be more of an impact on the community having it as a bed and breakfast than it would be with the kids. It's just in that case, it was a stigma. Right? And do you really want that? I mean, I have a sense, a feeling for the folks that have this NIMBYism issue. I mean, would I like a state prison to be built next to my house? I'm not quite sure of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could all think of things we really, really, really don't want to have next door. A nuclear power plant, a state prison. I mean, there's all kinds of things. But I guess, it just seems like you have to attack this concern about, the property value is somehow going to get diminished, or the whole quality of life is going to suffer if this change happens. And instead of the neighborhood that you've been familiar with for the last 20 or whatever years is now going to be different. It may not be better or worse, but it's going to be different. And so I think the point clearly is, I guess I just wonder now, as you're saying that, is that typically something that happens for like a developer to when, let's say you wanted to put a 50 units there, let's say on Depot Street, would it be a practice to go around to the neighbors and say, hey, this is what I'd like to do. I think it'd be a benefit for the community as a whole, but since you're going to be the ones who are going to be looking at it every day, what do you think? Or what are your concerns?
We did that all the time. Before we'd even present to the town the project, we would have a meeting with the neighbors to find out Okay, this is what we are proposing. Here's the site plan, has the elevations of the building, and has a complete view of the project as it is now and as it would be once it's complete. And we're talking several hundred homes. The biggest one was 900 homes, in Chatham, New Jersey. But we showed it to the community, and solicited their concerns. Now, were we successful? In most cases, we were. In some cases, no matter what you tried to do, you're not going to be successful. And then those people, when we got the approval from the community or from the local municipality and from the state, in some cases from the federal government as well, we would be sued. And that's another problem you have in Vermont that developers fear, and that is we go through all the approval process, and it can take several years, unfortunately, right? And then you get the approvals, and then a neighbor for $15 can file a lawsuit with the environmental court blocking the project. And then from the environmental court, they can go for another $15 to the Vermont Supreme Court.
Do they have to show any kind of standing that
They have to have standing.
that,
They're a neighbor. And they feel that
that's all it takes.
well, yeah, that this project is going to diminish the value of their home. It's going to diminish. There could be some psychological issues, or there could be some kind of land use issues. There could be some issues that, in their opinion, the project is not in conforming with the town plan, and so forth. I mean, you name it, and they'll bring it up. The mere fact is they can do it.
Mm-hmm.
And as a developer, are you going to say, do I really want to be part of this? And a good example is up in Heinsberg, where finally they got the local approval for 150 units in Heinsberg, which is outside of the Burlington area. It's a suburb of Burlington. 150 units. It took 8 years. Now, can you imagine what those homes would have looked like 8 years ago when interest rates were 2.5%? So now they're going out in the market with interest rates close to 7%, and it's a whole. And not only that, but the difficulty of getting material and getting labor, and the cost per square foot. So it's whether or not the project's even feasible today is another problem, even though you got the approvals. But so it's I think going back to where we began. I think all the issues the government and the legislature are working on to try to provide more housing, unless they address the NIMBYism issue, unless they address what's blocking housing and what's blocking developers from really looking to build. I mean, you could make all this land here on Route 7 in front of your building here available for development. But if the neighbors across the street don't like it, it doesn't make any difference. The town may be well intended in what they're trying to do, right? But that's not going to happen.
Oh, yeah, I know. I mean,
not down here.
No, I guess I confess I struggle to understand it sometimes. I mean, unless you're talking about something truly horrible being proposed, and it's so rare that something, like let's say, to use the example of state prison or whatever, is going to be built in a residential area. Usually those are someplace off the beaten track to some degree, where they're sealed off. And I just find it so hypocritical is too strong a word, perhaps, but
no, it's not. No, it's not, because you were you and I had the show here last year or the year before, when the town manager here of Manchester was retiring or moving on, and we talked about housing, and we talked about Ormsby Hill, and we talked about the fact that it was changed from 34 units down to 21. Why? And the why was the town said you cannot use density by counting steep slopes, 5% grades, or any wetlands in your density. So therefore, you don't have the land qualifying for housing that you thought you had. So they reduced from 34 down to 21. right? And how do I know that? I was a developer, right? So we built the 21 homes that now makes up Ormsby Hill. On this show, the town manager admitted that although he wasn't here at the time, he did say why they did that was they didn't want you to have any more increase in kids in the school. If you remember that.
Yeah, vaguely. I mean, of course, this is pretty ironic because right now we could use a lot more kids in schools, right? I mean, that's another big concern is like
That's right. And
the
that
schools are.
you would have what was the other impact you would have that we didn't want was more traffic, uh, um, and um, and the problem is the project has no kids. When we built it, there were no children uh, who were part of the buyer's family. But the mere fact that that's what was it was a zoning and environmental issue that was thrown up at us. But the fact of the matter was they didn't want the project.
Mm.
They didn't want it to go forward.
Well,
And that's the intellectual dishonesty, and that's the you used the word hypocrisy, but that's so
well,
the
I think it's a case where people kind of want it both ways. They want to have the pristine, everything the way it was, and yet at the same time have a thriving, active community. But those thriving active communities were built over a couple hundred years by building one layer of change on top of the other. I mean, you look at a picture of Manchester from 150 years ago, or whenever the first photographs were taken, and it looks very pretty, but it doesn't look like that now. And if it did, it would be a ghost town, right? Because nobody could afford to live here. And I guess I just think that while it's important to kind of reach out and understand why people have concerns about one kind of development or another that might impact what they're going to look out at, in the morning from their front door. That if we're going to be also worried about taxes and medical staff and business, a strong business environment to generate wealth and generate jobs, then it just doesn't happen by itself.
well, we're not going to solve the problem here, but
No.
if I can make a passing comment, and I mentioned it before, what could really help is that when projects are presented and that are in conformity with the existing zoning, and if people are objecting still to the project, come right out and be honest about why you are objecting to it, right? And then let's see, because this show is really devoted to
How do we find some kind of
conflict resolution,
yeah?
right? If there's something about that project that can be mitigated to your satisfaction, right, without making it so such that the project becomes unfeasible, then let's get it on the table. But let's check at the door intellectual dishonesty and come right out and say, look, I don't want a 140-foot tower. Had I been at those hearings up on the tower thing, which I wish I had second thought gone up there, I would have asked the people that were objecting to it, would they object to a 10-foot tower, right? And probably not, right? So it's a question between 10 feet maybe and 140 feet, which is what the tower is, right? So maybe we can resolve that, right? But at least get it on the table, right? The problem is, initially when that was proposed, it wasn't that people just didn't want that quote ugly tower there.
Yeah, I mean that was part of it, and the radiation concerns were another factor. I'm not enough of a scientist to know how founded and in fact, radiation concerns are. I'm sure there's plenty of studies that have been done about it, and maybe there's some good reason to be worried about that. But yeah, it's certainly a tough one. But unfortunately, Don, we're going to have to leave it there for today. I know we could go on talking about this for another 25 or 30 minutes, but I think just to kind of sum up, yeah, the whole idea of getting those concerns out on out on the table in the beginning, and trying to figure out a way to come to a satisfactory compromise or resolution early on before we go winding our way through the courts and burning up time and money it would be important. And I think it might also prompt some thoughts of like, well, this idea here isn't really so bad. I can live with it.
Well, to your point, and by doing that, if we can commit to that and show people that that's where we're at, it might attract more developers to come up here and participate. And by having more developers, we have more competition, and we can lower the cost, the square foot cost, possibly.
No, that would be a good thing. I think that's certainly something we need here, right? I think we can all agree on that one. Well, all right, Don. I guess we'll leave it there for today. But thanks again for coming in and
Thank you, and thank
helping us.
you all for spending the time with us today.
Absolutely, and we'll see you again the next time. Meanwhile, take care.